"Get on your knees," the officer barked, his tone sharp and cold. The woman, dressed in a simple blouse and slacks, hesitated for a moment. Her calm, steady eyes seemed to unnerve him, but he quickly masked it with aggression. He grabbed her wrist roughly and shoved her to the ground. Gravel bit into her palms as she fell, but she didn't cry out. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "Think you're better than me?" he sneered, his boot pressing against her back, forcing her down further. "All high and mighty, huh? Let's see how untouchable you are when the train comes through." The metallic clink of handcuffs echoed as he restrained her wrists. He didn't see her as a person. To him, she was just another target, someone to remind of her place, someone to humiliate. Dragging her by the cuffs, he pulled her toward the train tracks. The hum of distant traffic and the chirping of cicadas were drowned out by the sound of his cruelty. "You people," he spat, emphasizing the words like a curse, always playing the victim. "Time to learn what real power looks like." She didn't resist as he tied her ankles to the rails. Her silence infuriated him. He wanted her to beg, to plead for her life, to confirm his dominance. But she just stared at him, her expression unreadable, her resolve unshaken. "Say something," he shouted, his voice rising, cracking slightly as his frustration grew. He wanted to see fear, but all he saw was defiance. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm and cutting. "Is this the best you can do? Abuse your badge to feel like a man?" The insult hit harder than he expected. His face darkened, and for a moment, he seemed unsure. But he quickly masked it with a smirk, crouching beside her as the faint rumble of an approaching train began to echo in the distance. "You think this is a game? You think someone like you can talk to me like that? Sweetheart, I'm the law around here. Nobody's coming to save you." As the rumble grew louder, the officer stood, brushing off his hands as though dusting away guilt. He glanced back one last time, expecting to see terror finally etched across her face. Instead, he saw a faint, knowing smile. It stopped him cold, the train's horn blaring in the background like an omen. "You'll regret this," she said simply, her tone steady, unshaken. The officer turned and walked away, convinced of his invincibility, smug in his belief that he had asserted his dominance. But something about her calmness unsettled him. As he reached his patrol car, he felt a pang of doubt, though he quickly pushed it aside. He told himself she was just another troublemaker, someone who needed to be taught a lesson. But he couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't like the others. What the officer didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that his life was about to unravel. The woman he'd left on the tracks wasn't a nobody. She wasn't someone to be dismissed, humiliated, or erased. She was far more powerful than he could ever imagine, and his actions had set into motion events that would expose not only his corruption but the deep, systemic rot he had spent his career exploiting. The train passed, its roar fading into the distance, leaving nothing but silence and questions. What happened to her? Why was she so calm, so unafraid? And most importantly, who was she really? By the time the officer realized the truth, it would be too late. His career, his reputation, and the authority he clung to so desperately would all come crashing down. And as the pieces of his life fell apart, he'd be forced to confront not only his own actions but the woman who would ultimately hold the power to destroy or redeem him. Who was she? And why did she seem so certain that justice was already on its way? Stay with us to find out. This story is far from over. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism or discrimination. We believe in equality, justice, and the power of storytelling to inspire change and shed light on important issues. To our Black audience and allies, know that your voice, your experience, and your resilience matter. This channel is a safe space where impactful stories are told with care and respect. Thank you for being here. We're about to dive into a powerful narrative that will leave you reflecting and inspired. If you enjoy what you hear, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and join our community. Now, sit back, and enjoy the story. The summer heat hung heavy in the air, the kind of oppressive warmth that made even the most mundane activities feel unbearable. In the small southern town of Bedford Springs, time seemed to move slower, dragged down by the weight of history and unspoken divides. The streets were lined with modest houses, their faded paint a testament to years of neglect, and the heart of the town, a crumbling courthouse, loomed as a reminder of power wielded by those who rarely faced accountability. Monica Harris was a name that carried weight, though few in Bedford Springs knew it yet. At first glance, she appeared ordinary, a black woman in her late 30s with a sharp gaze and a quiet determination. Her professional demeanor masked the storms she had weathered, the battles fought, and the victories earned. Monica had recently relocated to Bedford Springs under the pretense of a transfer, but the real reason for her presence was far more calculated. She was the newly appointed chief of police, brought in to clean up a department plagued by corruption and systemic abuse. Her arrival had been unannounced, her true role concealed to observe the reality of her team before officially assuming command. For Monica, this wasn't just a job, it was a mission. She had risen through the ranks of law enforcement, overcoming prejudice and doubt at every step. Her success was hard-earned, a product of intelligence, perseverance, and an unshakable belief in justice. She had grown up in a neighborhood much like Bedford Springs, where trust in the police was almost non-existent. Monica had seen firsthand what unchecked authority could do, and she had vowed to be different. But she knew the battle ahead would test every ounce of her resolve. On the other side of town, Officer Brian Connors was starting his shift. Connors was a man of contradictions. In his mid-40s, he wore the uniform with pride, but it was a pride rooted not in service or protection, but in power. Bedford Springs had long been his playground. He knew every corner of the town, every face, and every unwritten rule that governed its dynamics. He was a product of the old guard, a force that thrived on fear and control. To Connors, the badge wasn't a responsibility, it was a shield to justify his actions. Connors wasn't always overtly malicious, but his prejudice ran deep, shaped by years of unchecked authority and a community that rarely held him accountable. He often targeted those who couldn't fight back, minorities, the poor, anyone he deemed weaker. To him, the idea of equality was an insult. He thrived on intimidation, on making people feel small. The police department mirrored Connors' ethos. It was a fraternity of silence, where loyalty trumped morality and any attempt to challenge the status quo was quickly stamped out. The officers worked more like a private militia than public servants, and Connors was their unspoken leader. The arrival of Monica Harris posed an unseen threat to their way of life, though no one, least of all Connors, realized it yet. Monica's first week in Bedford Springs was spent observing. She kept a low profile, intentionally blending in. She posed as a transfer officer, quietly taking notes, building relationships, and gauging the dynamics of the department. She noticed the hierarchy immediately, the way the officers deferred to Connors, the hushed jokes made in passing, the barely veiled hostility directed toward anyone who didn't fit their mold. One evening, while patrolling the outskirts of town, Monica witnessed Connors in action for the first time. He had pulled over a young black man for a minor traffic violation, though it quickly became apparent that the stop was less about enforcing the law and more about asserting dominance. Monica stayed back, observing from a distance, noting the way Connors escalated the situation with unnecessary aggression. It was a familiar scene, one Monica had seen play out countless times during her career, but it never got easier to watch. After the encounter, Monica confronted Connors subtly, questioning his approach. He dismissed her, his tone dripping with condescension. "Stick to your lane, Harris," he said with a smirk. "You're new here. You don't know how things work in Bedford Springs." Monica didn't react outwardly, but inside, the fire burned brighter. She knew Connors saw her as an outsider, someone to be dismissed or controlled. But she also knew that underestimating her was his first mistake. As days turned into weeks, the tension between Monica and Connors grew. He began to see her as a threat, though he couldn't quite place why. She was calm, professional, and unwavering, qualities that seemed to unnerve him. Connors thrived on fear and submission, and Monica offered neither. The tipping point came during a routine morning briefing. Connors made a racially charged comment about a recent arrest, drawing laughter from a few of his colleagues. Monica's sharp voice cut through the room like a blade. "That's enough," she said, her tone firm. The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Connors locked eyes with her, his smirk replaced by something colder. "Careful, Harris," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You don't want to step on the wrong toes." The line had been drawn, though neither of them realized how far it would escalate. Monica knew she couldn't tip her hand too soon. She needed proof, evidence to dismantle the toxic culture that had taken root in the department. Connors, on the other hand, saw her defiance as a challenge, one he intended to crush. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Connors decided to make his move. He had been watching Monica closely, looking for an opportunity to remind her of her place. That evening, he found it. A routine call came in about a disturbance on the edge of town. Connors took it upon himself to respond, radioing Monica to join him. When she arrived, the situation was eerily quiet. Connors was waiting by his patrol car, his demeanor casual but his eyes sharp. "Just a false alarm," he said, waving dismissively. "But since you're here, I thought I'd show you how we handle things in Bedford Springs." What followed was a calculated act of humiliation, one designed to strip Monica of her dignity and authority. Connors didn't see her as his equal, didn't see her as a person. To him, she was a threat that needed to be neutralized. But what he failed to see, what he would only realize too late, was that Monica Harris wasn't just another victim. She was a storm waiting to break, and Connors had just lit the match. Monica's hands clenched tightly around the steering wheel as she drove away from the station, her mind racing. Connors was growing bolder, testing boundaries she hadn't yet revealed were hers to enforce. Each interaction with him felt like a calculated attempt to assert dominance, as though he could bend her resolve with enough pressure. But Monica wasn't new to this game. She'd seen officers like him before, men who hid their fear of change behind bravado and aggression. She just hadn't expected the level of audacity he displayed or the quiet complicity of the others around him. The sun was setting as Monica parked her car on the outskirts of town. She had made it a habit to visit the communities most neglected by the department, the places where trust in law enforcement was virtually non-existent. Tonight, she had planned to meet with an elderly woman who had been calling about a series of break-ins the department had largely ignored. It was here, in these overlooked corners of Bedford Springs, that Monica felt the most connected to her purpose. But tonight, her focus wavered. Connor's words from earlier echoed in her mind, his smirk etched into her memory. She could feel the tension building, like a rope being pulled tighter with each passing moment. The woman she met with, Mrs. Evans, was kind but wary, her eyes betraying years of disappointment in promises that had gone unfulfilled. They spoke for over an hour about the break-ins, about the fear she and her neighbors lived with daily, and about the lack of any meaningful response from the police. Monica listened intently, taking notes, and assuring her that things would change. But as she drove away, she felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. Change was exactly what Connors and his circle feared, and they would stop at nothing to resist it. The next morning, Monica arrived at the station early, hoping to review a backlog of complaints that had been conveniently ignored by the department. As she settled into her desk, the door to the break room swung open, and Connors strolled in, his coffee in hand, his posture relaxed. He spotted her immediately, and his smirk returned. "Burning the midnight oil already, Harris? I didn't peg you for the type." Monica didn't look up, keeping her focus on the files in front of her. "Some of us are here to work, Connors. You should try it sometime." His chuckle was low and condescending. "Funny. But don't work too hard, okay? You might start making the rest of us look bad. She finally raised her eyes to meet his, her expression calm but unyielding. I don't need to make anyone look bad, Connors. That's a job you're doing all on your own. For a moment, his smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. But before he could respond, another officer entered the room, breaking the tension. Connors lingered for a moment longer before turning and walking away, but Monica knew the exchange had left its mark. His attempts to rattle her were failing, and it was clear he didn't know how to handle it. Over the next few days, the tension between them continued to build. Connors became increasingly aggressive, his comments sharper, his actions more deliberate. During a patrol, he went out of his way to embarrass Monica in front of a group of locals, pulling her aside to berate her for supposedly undermining his authority. The locals watched in silence, their distrust of the police evident in their wary gazes. Monica stood her ground, refusing to give Connors the reaction he was looking for. But inside, she felt the anger boiling, the frustration of having to endure his behavior for the sake of her mission. Later that week, Monica discovered something that made her blood run cold. While reviewing old case files, she found a pattern of misconduct tied directly to Connors. Complaints of excessive force, discriminatory practices, and even allegations of evidence tampering, all conveniently buried or dismissed. It was a smoking gun, proof of the corruption she had suspected. But it wasn't enough. She needed more than files, she needed undeniable, irrefutable evidence that would bring him down and expose the toxic culture he had cultivated. Monica began to dig deeper, reaching out to members of the community who had been victims of Connors' abuse. Many were hesitant to speak, afraid of retaliation, but a few shared their stories, their pain and anger fueling Monica's resolve. She documented everything, building a case piece by piece. But with each step forward, she felt the danger growing. Connors wasn't stupid. He could sense that something was shifting, that Monica was more than she seemed. The final straw came one rainy evening when Monica was called to respond to a disturbance at a local bar. When she arrived, she found Connors already there, his presence more of a threat than a solution. A young black man stood against the wall, his hands raised, his expression one of resignation. Connors loomed over him, his voice loud and commanding, accusing the man of being involved in a fight that witnesses said he hadn't started. Monica stepped in, her tone firm. That's enough, Connors. Let's handle this by the book. Connors turned to her, his face a mask of irritation. By the book? You mean the book that lets punks like this get away with murder? No thanks, Harris. I'll do it my way. The tension in the room was palpable, the other officers and bystanders watching intently. Monica took a step closer, lowering her voice so only Connors could hear. If you keep pushing, you're going to regret it. This isn't a game, Connors. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she saw the flicker of fear behind his bravado. But it was quickly replaced by anger. You don't belong here, Harris. You think you can come into my town and tell me how to do my job? Let me tell you something, you're out of your depth. He stormed out of the bar, leaving Monica with a sinking feeling in her chest. She knew he wouldn't let this go, that his pride and arrogance wouldn't allow him to back down. And she was right. The next day, Connors orchestrated a situation that would push Monica to her breaking point, a calculated act of humiliation designed to remind her of who he believed held the real power. As the rain continued to fall that evening, Monica sat alone in her car, staring out at the empty streets of Bedford Springs. The weight of the coming storm pressed heavily on her chest, but she refused to falter. She had come too far, fought too hard, to back down now. Connors had underestimated her, just as so many had before. But he was about to learn that Monica Harris was not someone to be dismissed or defeated. The stage was set, the tension building with every passing moment. And as the storm brewed, one question loomed large: how far would Connors go to protect his power, and what would it cost him? The night was suffocatingly quiet, the kind of silence that pressed down on you and made every small sound feel deafening. The train tracks stretched into the darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow of the moon. Monica's wrists burned against the tightness of the handcuffs, her body rigid as the cold steel rails pressed against her back. The distant hum of an approaching train barely registered in her mind. Her focus was locked on Connors, standing a few feet away with his arms crossed, his shadow cutting a jagged line across the gravel. "You thought you could come into my town and change everything, didn't you?" Connors said, his voice dripping with contempt. He stepped closer, the crunch of his boots on the gravel slicing through the night. "You thought you could undermine me, make me look weak. But here's the thing, Monica, you're not in charge. I am." Monica's gaze never wavered. Even as the cold seeped into her bones, even as the weight of the moment pressed down on her, she refused to let him see her fear. "You think this makes you strong?" she asked, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "You think tying me to these tracks makes you a man?" Connors crouched down beside her, his smirk returning, his face inches from hers. "It makes me the law. And you? You're just another lesson for the rest of them. They'll see what happens when you challenge authority. When you challenge me." The train's horn blared in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Monica could feel the vibrations in the rails beneath her, but she didn't flinch. She kept her eyes locked on Connors, her expression unyielding. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," she said, her voice calm but sharp. "You think you're untouchable, but you're about to find out how wrong you are." Connors stood, his smirk faltering for just a moment before he regained his composure. "You don't get it, do you? No one's coming to save you. You're alone, Harris. You've always been alone." The train's headlights cut through the darkness, a blinding beam that illuminated the scene in stark clarity. Connors stepped back, his hands on his hips, as though admiring his work. "This is where your story ends," he said, his voice almost casual. But Monica didn't look at the train. She didn't look at the cuffs or the tracks or the looming inevitability of what was coming. She looked at Connors, her expression unreadable. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" The question hung in the air, cutting through the noise of the approaching train. Connors froze, the confidence in his posture faltering. For the first time, doubt flickered across his face. "What are you talking about?" Monica leaned her head back against the rail, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "You've spent weeks trying to intimidate me, to break me. But you never bothered to look deeper. You never asked yourself why I was really here." The train's horn was deafening now, the ground trembling beneath them. Connors glanced over his shoulder, then back at Monica, his confidence unraveling. "You're bluffing," he said, but the words lacked conviction. Monica's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "Am I?" The train was almost upon her when, suddenly, it screeched to a halt, the sound of grinding metal piercing the air. The headlights bathed Connors in harsh light, revealing every bead of sweat on his brow, every crack in his mask of arrogance. Monica didn't move, her calmness in stark contrast to Connor's growing panic. From the shadows, several figures emerged, officers, officials, and a man in a suit holding a badge that glinted in the moonlight. Connors turned, his confusion giving way to shock as he recognized the faces. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice rising. The man with the badge stepped forward, his tone authoritative. "Brian Connors, you're under arrest for abuse of power, assault, and a litany of other charges that we'll be happy to list for you back at the station." Connors stumbled back, his bravado crumbling. "This is a mistake," he stammered, his voice breaking. "You don't know what you're doing." Monica slowly sat up, the cuffs around her wrists undone by one of the officers who had rushed to her side. She stood, brushing herself off, her composure intact. "I warned you, Connors," she said, her voice steady. "You should have listened." Connors turned to her, desperation in his eyes. "You set me up. This was all a setup." Monica stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "No, Connors. This was justice. Something you wouldn't recognize if it hit you in the face. The man with the badge motioned for the other officers to take Connors into custody. As they dragged him away, his protests grew weaker, drowned out by the murmurs of the gathering crowd that had begun to form. Monica watched him go, her expression unreadable, her mind racing with the weight of what had just unfolded. As the officers dispersed and the scene began to clear, one of them approached Monica. "Chief Harris," he said, addressing her by her true title for the first time. "Are you okay?" Monica nodded, her focus still on the spot where Connors had stood moments before. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice carried a note of exhaustion. "But this is just the beginning. There's a lot of work to be done." The officer nodded, his respect for her evident. "We'll follow your lead." Monica took a deep breath, the tension in her chest easing as she turned to face the town she had sworn to protect. The storm had passed, but the fight for justice was far from over. And for the first time since her arrival, she felt the weight of her mission lighten, replaced by a quiet, unshakable resolve. The air was still heavy with tension as the officers loaded Connors into the back of a squad car. His shouts had dulled into incoherent mutters, a man stripped of the power he once believed untouchable. Monica stood at the edge of the scene, her shoulders squared, but the weight of the moment was etched into her expression. The flashing red and blue lights danced across her face, but her thoughts were miles away. She could hear the low murmurs of the gathered crowd, their curiosity and vindication mingling in the night air. As the squad car door slammed shut, Connor's voice cut through the noise. "This isn't over, Harris. You think you've won, but you don't know who you're messing with." His words were a final grasp at control, the hollow echo of a man who'd lost everything. Monica turned to face him, her gaze piercing. "You're right about one thing, Connors," she said, her voice carrying above the din. "This isn't over. But it's not over for you because of me. It's over because of every person you silenced, every life you destroyed, and every ounce of trust you shattered. You did this to yourself." He sneered, but his usual bravado was gone, replaced by something desperate and unsteady. The officers didn't wait for a response, slamming the door behind him and driving off into the night. Monica watched the car disappear down the road, the faint roar of its engine fading into silence. For the first time in weeks, she let herself exhale. One of the younger officers approached her cautiously, his face a mix of admiration and unease. "Chief, do you think he'll talk? Spill everything?" Monica turned to him, her expression unreadable. "He doesn't have a choice. Men like Connors survive by clinging to their lies, but when those lies crumble, they'll say anything to save themselves. He'll talk. And when he does, we'll be ready." The officer nodded, his respect evident in his gaze, but he hesitated before walking away. Monica noticed. "What is it?" she asked, her voice softer now. He shifted uncomfortably. I didn't know. About you, I mean. The way you handled all of this, it's not something we've ever seen here. People like Connors have always been untouchable." Monica studied him for a moment, measuring her words. "That's the problem. Untouchable isn't real. It's just fear dressed up as power. And fear only works if we let it. Remember that." The officer nodded again, a spark of something, hope, perhaps, igniting in his eyes. As he walked away, Monica turned back to the scene, her mind already shifting to the next steps. The hard part wasn't over, it was just beginning. The crowd had thinned, but a few stragglers remained, their curiosity evident. An older man stepped forward, his face lined with years of struggle. He looked at Monica with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "You really did it," he said, his voice low but steady. "You brought him down." Monica nodded, her expression softening. "It wasn't just me. It was everyone who had the courage to speak up, to demand better. This isn't just about Connors. It's about making sure no one like him can ever do this again." The man smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. It's been a long time since we had someone in your position who cared about people like us. Don't let them break you. Her chest tightened at his words, the weight of the responsibility sinking in even deeper. I won't, she said, her voice firm. But I can't do it alone. Change doesn't happen because of one person. It happens because people come together and demand it. He nodded, stepping back into the shadows as the crowd finally dispersed. Monica stood alone for a moment, the quiet settling around her like a shroud. The adrenaline that had carried her through the night was fading, leaving behind exhaustion and a deep, aching resolve. Back at the station, the atmosphere was electric. Officers moved with purpose, files being pulled, conversations hushed but intense. Monica stepped into her office, the door clicking shut behind her. She sank into her chair, running a hand through her hair as she stared at the stack of reports on her desk. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Detective Alvarez, one of the few officers who had supported her from the start. He stepped inside, his expression grim but determined. Connors is already talking, he said, handing her a folder. And you were right. He's naming names. It's worse than we thought. Monica opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages. Each name, each allegation, was a piece of the puzzle she'd been trying to assemble. Her stomach churned as the extent of the corruption became clear. This isn't just a few bad apples, she said quietly. It's the whole tree. Alvarez nodded, his jaw tight. What do we do now? Monica closed the folder, her expression hardening. We don't stop. We take this to the DA, to the state, to anyone who will listen. This department is going to be rebuilt from the ground up, and if that means tearing it down first, so be it. Alvarez hesitated, then spoke, his voice tinged with worry. You know this isn't going to be easy. There are people who won't want this to come out. People with power. Monica met his gaze, her resolve unshaken. I didn't come here for easy, Alvarez. I came here for justice. And I'm not leaving until we get it. He nodded, a faint smile breaking through his serious demeanor. I'll make the calls. As he left, Monica leaned back in her chair, the folder still in her hands. The path ahead was daunting, filled with uncertainty and danger. But for the first time since she'd arrived in Bedford Springs, she felt a glimmer of hope. The tide was turning, and there was no going back. The quiet was broken by the sound of her phone vibrating on the desk. She picked it up, her brows furrowing as she read the message on the screen. It was from an unknown number, but the words were clear, "Be careful, Chief. Some people don't like change." Monica stared at the message, her mind racing. The battle was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. But she refused to back down. Not now. Not ever. The station had quieted after the chaos of the previous night, but the air was heavy with the weight of what had happened. The hum of conversations, the rustle of papers, and the occasional ring of a phone created a backdrop of urgency. Monica sat in her office, the door slightly ajar, listening to the subdued bustle outside. The fallout from Connor's arrest was only beginning to unfold, and with every hour that passed, the scope of the corruption became clearer. It wasn't just one man. It was a system, a structure that had allowed men like Connors to thrive. Detective Alvarez entered, his steps slower than usual, his face marked with exhaustion. He carried another folder, the weight of it visible in the way he held it. Placing it gently on Monica's desk, he sat down across from her, his expression grim. "We've got more," he said, his voice low but steady. "Connors didn't just talk, he sang. The names he gave us, it's bigger than we thought. 3 officers in narcotics, and their ties reach out of Bedford Springs. We're talking statewide. This isn't just a dirty department, it's part of a larger network." Monica took a deep breath and opened the folder, scanning the names and allegations within. Each entry felt like a gut punch, a stark reminder of just how deep the rot went. Her fingers tightened on the pages as she read, the enormity of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. "This isn't just about cleaning house anymore," she said, her voice firm but tinged with disbelief. "This is about dismantling an entire machine." Alvarez nodded, his jaw set. "If we take this higher, we're going to make some powerful enemies. People who have a lot to lose." Monica leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the ceiling as she gathered her thoughts. "Then we'll do it the right way. Piece by piece. We'll follow every lead, build a case they can't ignore, and make sure the truth comes out. No shortcuts, no mistakes. We're not just fighting Connors anymore, we're fighting everything he represents." Alvarez studied her for a moment before speaking again, his tone cautious. "You know this isn't going to end clean, right? There are people in high places who'll do anything to keep this buried. We're going to be walking a tightrope." Monica met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I didn't come here to play it safe, Alvarez. I came here to fix what's broken, no matter how dangerous it gets." Alvarez nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Then let's get to work." As he left, Monica closed the folder, her thoughts swirling. Each name represented a piece of the puzzle, a thread leading to something larger and more insidious. She knew this was the kind of fight that would test her limits, but she also knew she couldn't turn back now. The next morning, Monica called a department-wide meeting. Officers gathered in the briefing room, their faces marked with unease and uncertainty. The absence of Connors and his closest allies was glaring, their empty chairs a stark reminder of the changes taking place. Monica stood at the front of the room, her posture commanding but not overbearing, and let the silence stretch, forcing everyone to sit with the weight of what was happening. "Last night changed everything," she began, her voice steady but carrying the gravity of her words. "Connors is gone, and with him, the toxic culture that has infected this department for years. But let me be clear, this isn't over. This is just the beginning." The room remained silent, the tension palpable. Monica continued, her gaze sweeping over the officers. "I know many of you are feeling uncertain, maybe even scared. Some of you might be angry. And I know there are those of you who are wondering if you're next. Here's the truth, if you've done your job with integrity, if you've treated this community with respect, you have nothing to fear. But if you've been complicit, if you've turned a blind eye to the abuse of power, then yes, you should be worried. Because we're not stopping until this department is rebuilt from the ground up." An older officer, Sergeant Daniels, stood from his seat, his face a mix of frustration and apprehension. His voice carried a note of defiance as he addressed her. "Chief, with all due respect, what you're talking about isn't just a cleanup. It's tearing down everything we've known. Do you really think we can come back from that?" Monica's expression didn't waver. "I think we have to. Because the alternative is letting this corruption continue, letting it fester and destroy what little trust this community has left. And that's not an option." Daniels hesitated, then nodded slowly, his resistance softening as he sat back down. The room remained heavy with tension, but Monica could see the flickers of understanding beginning to take hold. She didn't expect immediate agreement, change was never easy. But the seed had been planted, and that was enough for now. As the meeting dispersed, Monica returned to her office, her mind already racing with plans for what came next. The quiet knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. When she looked up, she saw Mrs. Evans, the elderly woman who had become a symbol of the community's resilience. She carried a plate of cookies, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them on Monica's desk. "I heard about what you did," Mrs. Evans said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "I just wanted to say thank you. For standing up for us. For showing us that things can change." Monica smiled, the simple gesture cutting through her exhaustion. "Thank you, Mrs. Evans. But we're just getting started. There's still so much to do." The older woman nodded, her eyes glistening with hope. I know. But you've already done more than anyone else ever has. As the day wore on, Monica found herself reflecting on the enormity of what lay ahead. The investigation was uncovering truths that reached far beyond Bedford Springs, and the pushback would only grow stronger. But for the first time, she felt the tide beginning to turn. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. The message was from Alvarez, another lead. It's big. Meet me at the station. Monica grabbed her coat, her steps purposeful as she headed out the door. The storm wasn't over, but she was ready. The fight for justice was just beginning, and she wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The late evening air was thick with anticipation as Monica stepped into the station. The soft hum of activity carried a tension that hadn't existed before. Officers moved with purpose, their hushed conversations filled with words like evidence, warrants, and arrests. Monica's eyes scanned the room, her mind sorting through the countless threads of information that were beginning to come together into a picture that was both overwhelming and terrifying. Alvarez was waiting for her near the conference room, his face serious but steady. "They're ready," he said simply, motioning for her to follow him. Monica adjusted her coat and walked beside him, her steps purposeful but her heart heavy. Inside the room, a small group of trusted officers and state investigators were gathered around a table covered with files, maps, and photographs. The atmosphere was charged, a mix of determination and unease. Alvarez gestured toward the map pinned to the wall, red strings crisscrossing between locations that stretched far beyond Bedford Springs. "This is what we've pieced together so far," he began, his voice calm but firm. The narcotics unit wasn't just skimming evidence or roughing up suspects. They were part of a larger network funneling drugs into small towns like ours, using the department as cover. Connors wasn't the head of it, but he was a key player. He kept things running smoothly here while feeding information up the chain. Monica studied the map, her stomach churning at the enormity of what they were uncovering. "And the names Connors gave us? Have they been corroborated?" Alvarez nodded. "Most of them, yes. We've got enough to start issuing warrants, but this isn't something we can handle alone. We're going to need state and federal support to take this all the way." The room fell silent as Monica processed his words. She turned to the group, her voice steady but intense. "This isn't just about bringing down a few dirty cops. This is about dismantling a system that's been exploiting communities like ours for years. It's going to be messy, and it's going to take time. But we can't afford to stop now." One of the state investigators, a sharp-eyed woman named Carter, leaned forward. "Chief Harris, you need to understand what you're walking into. This network has ties to powerful people. Politicians, business owners, even other law enforcement agencies. They're not going to go down without a fight." Monica met her gaze, her resolve unshaken. "Let them fight. The more noise they make, the more attention this gets. We do this by the book, and we don't back down." The room buzzed with renewed energy as plans were made and tasks assigned. Warrants were drafted, evidence catalogued, and strategies outlined. Monica stayed until the early hours of the morning, her presence a steadying force amidst the chaos. But as the room emptied and the adrenaline began to fade, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on her. She walked back to her office, the stillness of the station eerie in its contrast to the earlier activity. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly as she sat at her desk, her head in her hands. She knew the fight was just beginning, and while she felt ready, she couldn't ignore the gnawing fear that lurked beneath her resolve. A knock on the door startled her, and she looked up to see Alvarez standing there, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He stepped inside, placing one on her desk before sitting down across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. "You did good tonight," he said finally, his voice soft but sincere. "The team needed to see you leading this. It gives them hope." Monica managed a small smile, her fingers wrapping around the warm cup. Hope is one thing. Keeping them motivated when things get harder is another. Alvarez nodded, his expression thoughtful. They'll follow you, Chief. Not because they have to, but because they believe in what you're doing. That's rare in this line of work. Monica looked at him, her gratitude evident. Thank you, Alvarez. For sticking with this. With me. He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Someone has to keep you out of trouble. They both chuckled softly, the moment of levity a welcome reprieve from the tension. But the seriousness returned quickly, the weight of the situation settling back in. As Alvarez left, Monica sat back in her chair, sipping her coffee as she stared at the map on her wall. Each pin represented a piece of the puzzle, a step closer to exposing the truth. But she knew the closer they got, the more dangerous it would become. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her attention. It was a message from an unknown number. Stop now, or you'll regret it. Monica stared at the words, her mind racing. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. She took a deep breath, her grip tightening on the phone. If they were trying to scare her, it wouldn't work. If anything, it only strengthened her resolve. The next day was a whirlwind of activity. Warrants were executed, arrests made, and new evidence uncovered. The community began to take notice, their curiosity and hope growing as the extent of the corruption came to light. But with every victory came new challenges. Rumors of retaliation began to spread, whispers of people in power working to protect their interests. Monica found herself at the center of it all, the steady force driving the investigation forward. But even she couldn't ignore the risks. The threats grew more direct, the pressure more intense. And through it all, she kept pushing, refusing to let fear dictate her actions. One evening, as she was leaving the station, she noticed a car parked across the street, its headlights off but the silhouette of a figure visible inside. She paused, her instincts kicking in. For a moment, she considered confronting them, but she thought better of it. Instead, she climbed into her car, her movements deliberate as she drove away, her eyes constantly scanning the mirrors. Back at home, she locked the doors and sat in the darkness, her mind replaying the events of the day. The fight was escalating, the stakes higher than ever. But Monica Harris wasn't one to back down. The storm was coming, and she would face it head-on, no matter what it cost her. The headlights from passing cars cast fleeting shadows across Monica's living room as she sat in silence, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen the only sound breaking the stillness. Her phone sat on the coffee table in front of her, its screen glowing faintly with a message she hadn't yet opened. The threat from the night before lingered in her mind, a reminder that the battle she was waging was as dangerous as it was necessary. She reached for her glass of water, the cool condensation wetting her fingertips as she took a slow sip, trying to quiet the storm in her thoughts. The knock at her door made her freeze, the sound sharp and sudden in the quiet. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. She walked to the door, peering through the peephole before unlocking it. Alvarez stood on the other side, his expression tense but calm, a folder tucked under his arm. "I didn't mean to drop by unannounced," he said as she opened the door. But this couldn't wait. Monica stepped aside, letting him in, her eyes narrowing as she noticed the folder. "What's going on?" He placed the folder on the coffee table and sat down, his movements deliberate. "We've got a problem," he began, his tone measured. "That message you showed me? We traced it back to a burner phone, but that's not the real issue. Someone leaked part of the investigation to the press." Monica's heart sank, though her face remained impassive. "What did they get?" "Enough to make things messy," Alvarez replied, opening the folder to reveal copies of emails and headlines. "They're spinning it like we're targeting the department unfairly, like this is some kind of personal vendetta against Connors and his allies. The mayor's office is already fielding calls, and some of our state support is starting to get cold feet. Monica picked up one of the pages, scanning the inflammatory language. Words like witch hunt and overreach jumped out at her, stoking a fire that had been simmering since the investigation began. "They're trying to turn this into a political game," she said, her voice low but edged with frustration. "Undermine the credibility of the investigation, discredit me, and make it all go away." Alvarez nodded. "It's classic damage control. Whoever's pulling the strings knows how to play this." Monica set the paper down, her mind already racing through the implications. "We need to get ahead of this. If we let them control the narrative, everything we've worked for could fall apart." Alvarez leaned back, his arms crossed. "How?" "The people running this operation have more resources, more connections. We're already stretched thin." Monica met his gaze, her voice steady but determined. "Then we fight smarter. We focus on the facts, the evidence. We make it impossible for anyone to ignore the truth." She stood, pacing as she spoke, her movements purposeful. "Schedule a press conference. Tomorrow. I'll address this head-on. And in the meantime, we keep working. We double down on the investigation, tighten our circle, and make sure every piece of evidence is airtight. They want to play games. Fine. But we don't back down." Alvarez watched her for a moment before nodding, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're relentless, you know that." Monica paused, her expression softening just enough to show a hint of humor. "I have to be." The next morning, the station was buzzing with activity as the press conference loomed. Monica stood in her office, adjusting her blazer in the reflection of the window. She could see the gathering crowd outside, reporters setting up cameras and microphones while officers moved in and out of view. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. Alvarez knocked lightly on the door before stepping in. "It's time," he said simply. Monica nodded, her expression calm but resolute. She followed him through the station, the hum of conversation fading as she approached the podium set up on the steps outside. The crowd quieted as she took her place, the clicking of cameras the only sound for a moment. She scanned the faces in the crowd, her gaze steady as she began to speak. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying over the assembled press. "Over the past several weeks, my team and I have been conducting an investigation into corruption within the Bedford Springs Police Department. This investigation has uncovered serious misconduct, including abuse of power, evidence tampering, and ties to a larger criminal network." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "This is not a witch hunt. This is not a vendetta. This is about justice. It's about holding those who have violated their oath accountable, no matter how high the cost." A reporter raised a hand, her voice cutting through the silence. "Chief Harris, some are saying this investigation is politically motivated. How do you respond to that?" Monica met her gaze without hesitation. "This investigation is motivated by one thing, the truth. Politics have no place in this. The facts speak for themselves, and the evidence will be presented in due course. My only agenda is to restore trust and integrity to this department." The questions continued, each one met with the same calm, measured responses. Monica held her ground, refusing to let the pressure shake her. By the time the press conference ended, the narrative had begun to shift. The focus was back on the investigation, the facts, and the need for accountability. Back inside the station, Alvarez approached her, a hint of admiration in his voice. "You handled that like a pro." Monica gave a small nod, the exhaustion starting to creep in. "Let's hope it's enough." As the day wore on, the tension in the station began to ease, but Monica knew the fight was far from over. The leaks, the threats, the mounting pressure, it was all part of a larger effort to derail their progress. But she also knew that every step forward brought them closer to the truth, and that was a fight worth enduring. Later that evening, as she sat alone in her office, the phone rang. She answered, her voice steady despite the exhaustion. This is Chief Harris. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, cold and calculated. You think you've won, don't you? You think exposing Connors and his little operation is going to change anything? Monica didn't flinch. Who is this? That's not important, the voice replied. What's important is that you know when to stop. Walk away now, or things will get worse. For you, for your team, for everyone who trusts you. Monica leaned forward, her grip tightening on the phone. You're scared. That's why you're calling. You know we're close, and you know you can't stop us. There was a pause, the silence heavy with tension. You have no idea what you're up against, the voice said before the line went dead. Monica set the phone down, her mind racing. The fight was far from over, but she was more determined than ever to see it through. No matter the cost. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation and tension. The trial of Brian Connors had captured national attention, not just for the scale of corruption it revealed but for the story of one woman's unrelenting fight for justice. Monica sat in the front row, her hands resting on her lap, her posture straight and composed. She had seen this moment play out in her mind countless times, but being here now, on the brink of closure, was almost surreal. The prosecutor delivered their final statement, the weight of the evidence against Connors overwhelming. Connors sat at the defense table, his once arrogant demeanor replaced by something hollow. His suit was perfectly pressed, but he looked smaller somehow, diminished by the truth that had finally caught up with him. When the judge read the verdict, guilty on all charges, the courtroom erupted in whispers and quiet gasps. Monica didn't react outwardly, but a sense of profound relief washed over her. Justice, long overdue, had finally been served. The ripple effects of Connors' conviction were already being felt. Investigations into the wider network had intensified, with key players exposed and arrested. The narcotics ring that had operated in the shadows for years was dismantled, piece by piece. Monica's relentless pursuit of the truth had become a symbol of hope and accountability, not just in Bedford Springs but far beyond its borders. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, their cheers erupting as Monica stepped out onto the steps. Reporters thrust microphones toward her, their questions overlapping in a chaotic blur. Alvarez was by her side, offering quiet support as she raised a hand to silence the crowd. This isn't just a victory for me, she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. This is a victory for every person who has been silenced, every community that has been overlooked, and every individual who has fought for justice against impossible odds. Today proves that change is possible when we stand together and refuse to back down. The crowd erupted again, their applause a mix of celebration and vindication. Monica felt a rare smile cross her face, the weight of the past months finally starting to lift. Alvarez leaned in, his voice low but warm. You've done it, Chief. You've set the bar. Monica turned to him, her expression softening. We've done it. None of this would have been possible without you and the team. Later that evening, Monica returned to her home, the quiet feeling strange after the chaos of the day. She sat on her couch, staring out the window as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sense of accomplishment was real, but so was the exhaustion. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Mrs. Evans, a simple note of gratitude that brought a lump to Monica's throat. You've given us hope, Chief Harris. Thank you for everything. The months that followed were a whirlwind of rebuilding and reform. Monica worked tirelessly to restructure the department, rooting out the remnants of corruption and fostering a culture of accountability and respect. It wasn't easy, change never was, but with each step forward, she saw the beginnings of a better future for Bedford Springs. Officers who had once been complicit were either reformed or replaced, and the community's trust in law enforcement began to heal. Connors, stripped of his power and sentenced to decades in prison, had become a cautionary tale. He no longer shouted defiance or threats, his arrogance replaced by the quiet resignation of a man who had lost everything. Monica visited the prison once, not to gloat but to ensure he understood the impact of his actions. Their conversation was brief, but it left her with a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. For Alvarez, the journey had been equally transformative. His loyalty to Monica and the cause had solidified their partnership, and he became a key figure in the department's new leadership. Together, they set an example for what policing could and should be, an institution rooted in service, not power. Monica's story didn't end with Bedford Springs. Her work caught the attention of state and national organizations, leading to opportunities to share her expertise and advocate for systemic reform. But no matter where her career took her, she remained deeply connected to the town that had tested her resolve and shaped her mission. As she stood on the steps of the courthouse one last time, addressing the people of Bedford Springs before moving on to her next chapter, Monica felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. "This isn't goodbye," she told the crowd, her voice carrying over the gathered faces. "It's a new beginning, for me, for all of us. The work we've done here is proof that change is possible, no matter how difficult. But it's up to you to carry it forward." The crowd applauded, their cheers a mix of gratitude and hope. Monica smiled, the weight of her journey finally giving way to the promise of what was to come. Reflecting on this story, what does it teach us about justice, perseverance, and the power of standing up for what's right? Monica's journey reminds us that true change begins with a single act of courage. It challenges us to look at the systems around us and ask hard questions, to demand better from those in power, and to never underestimate the strength of one voice raised against injustice. What would you do if faced with the same obstacles? How would you fight for what you believe is right? Thank you for joining us for this powerful story. If it inspired you, moved you, or made you think, we invite you to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge and surprise. Don't forget to leave a comment with your thoughts, we'd love to hear how this story resonated with you. And as always, thank you for being part of this journey with us. Until next time.